We entered a hammock or dark grove consisting of various kinds of trees. This continues near a mile when it once opens to view the most sudden transition from darkness to light that can possibly be exhibited in a natural landscape. The extensive Alachua savanna is a level green plain, above 15 miles over, 50 miles in circumference, and scarcely a tree or bush of any kind to be seen on it.
This is how William Bartram, the famous botanist and explorer from Philadelphia, described his first view in late spring 1774 of a sunken, grassy expanse located in colonial Florida. Throughout history, this rich and diverse basin, which became known as Payne's Prairie after a Seminole chief, has attracted Native Americans, early settlers, and modern man, lured here by its abundant wildlife and fertile soil. The word prairie is used to describe a vast, treeless expanse of landscape dominated by grasses, herbs, and shrubs. Unlike the large, relatively dry prairies of the Midwest, Payne's Prairie is a freshwater marsh with diverse plant associations that vary according to the frequency and duration of flooding. Historically, water drained from the uplands flowed across the basin and entered a system of underground streams through a large sinkhole on the north side of the prairie. This unusual condition accounts for the drastic and unpredictable changes that have occurred here. In 1871, the sink became plugged with logs and debris, causing the water level to rise, changing the prairie into a large lake. Steamboats were put into use hauling crops from the farms south of the basin to markets in Gainesville. Then, in 1891, almost as suddenly as it was formed, the plug in the sink broke loose, and within a week the basin was drained, leaving only a few ponds. Soon the seeds of various plants, either dormant in the sediment or dropped by animals in the winds, began to sprout and colonize the lake bed, returning it to prairie and marsh once again. The scenery that stretches before us today is the product of complex and persistent natural forces that have worked through the ages to shape and reshape the physical structure of the basin. The formation of Payne's Prairie began some 30,000 years ago within the limestone bedrock that lies beneath the sandy, rolling hills that extend down the center of the Florida Peninsula. This limestone was formed from the shells of marine animals that accumulated on the floor of ancient seas during a time when sea levels were much higher. As rain falls, it becomes mildly acidic by absorbing carbon dioxide from the air and by leaching organic acids from decaying vegetation. Seeping into the cracks in the underlying bedrock, it slowly dissolves portions of the limestone, creating many large caverns deep within the earth. Eventually, the ceilings of the caverns become so thin that they collapse under the weight of the sand and clay above. Slowly, over thousands of years, the uplands sank into these ever-enlarging cavities, creating the Payne's Prairie Basin as we know it. This process is continuing as indicated by the large number of sinkholes occurring around the edge of the basin. To the casual viewer, the basin may appear as a monotonous sheet of green. However, a closer look reveals a variety of colors and textures, each indicating a different plant community. Near the center of the basin are several ponds of open water bordered by cattails, indicating that this area is flooded year-round. Beyond the cattails, where the elevation increases slightly and flooding is less frequent, we find vast stretches of maiden cane and pickerel weed, along with many other species of plants. Thus, the close observer sees the system as rich and diverse, constantly adjusting in accordance with the changing seasons. Near the edge of the basin, we can see a fascinating struggle between the grasses and herbs of the prairie and the trees and the shrubs of the uplands. During dry years, the forest advances on the prairie, killing back the grass with the shade of its dense foliage. Then, during prolonged periods of high water, the advantage changes. The young trees, not adapted to the wet conditions, die, and the grasses reclaim their original territory. The grasses have yet another advantage over the trees in the struggle for space. For thousands of years, lightning has been setting fires that sweep across the landscape. Grasses have become adapted to surviving frequent burning. Since grass plants have an extensive root system below the ground, the stored nutrients in their roots allow leaves to sprout and regrow quickly after a fire, while tree seedlings are killed by the scorching of their thin bark. Thus, fire and flooding favor the advance of the prairie, while drought and the absence of fire favors the forest. Moving up the basin rim, we enter another community, the shady forests that grow on the sandy, well-drained soils of the uplands. This area provides the cover, denning, and nesting places required by the various upland animal species that often venture onto the prairie to feed. Payne's Prairie State Preserve is a land of lakes, marshes, grasslands, and woodlands, all acting and interacting to create one of the richest and most productive wildlife habitats in Florida. Over 350 kinds of mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fishes, and countless invertebrates are found here, each playing a vital role in the complex food chains that support this incredible variety of living things. Throughout the more recent past, humans have also been an important part of the basin's food chains. Some 10,000 years ago, Native Americans came here to hunt large grazing animals, some of which are now extinct. The number of people inhabiting the area increased as one culture gradually replaced another. As the native population became more and more dependent on agriculture, the character of the land changed. Corn and other vegetables replaced the native grasses on the drier reaches of the prairie. Then came the Spanish explorers who brought cattle and citrus to the region. The basin was grazed and the uplands were cleared and planted in fruit trees. Later, the Seminoles farmed and grazed the area. More changes occurred after Florida became part of the United States, often faster than some native animals could adapt. By the early 1800s, the bison, and a century later the red wolf, disappeared from Florida, while many other species became greatly reduced in numbers. As white settlers began to cultivate and graze the basin more intensely, the character of the landscape changed even further. Although farming or grazing was usually profitable, it was also risky and unpredictable due to the seasonal flooding. By the 20th century, the water that had created and shaped this fertile plain was regarded as a nuisance to be controlled, because it did not always come in the right amounts or at the right time. As technology advanced, the basin's appearance changed as efforts were made to reduce the flooding. Canals were dug, dikes and dams were built, all for the single purpose of removing water from the basin. Although many man-made changes were imposed upon it, Payne's Prairie remained an area with abundant and diverse wildlife populations and magnificent scenic vistas. In 1970, Payne's Prairie was acquired by the state of Florida to be administered and managed as a preserve by the Division of Recreation and Parks. Then began the slow, complicated process of restoring the basin as nearly as possible to the condition described by William Bartram in the late 1700s. This requires an understanding of the complex forces and processes that enable the basin to function naturally. Through continuing research and consultation with specialists, management objectives and techniques were identified and put into practice. The goal is to restore the seasonal rise and fall of water levels and to reintroduce fire, which once prevented the advance of trees and shrubs onto the prairie. As research revealed man's effects on the prairie basin, it became obvious that restoring the system would be difficult and challenging. Water, the lifeblood of the basin, drains from the uplands beyond the preserve boundary. Some of the water now entering the preserve is used as a cheap, convenient means of disposing of sewage effluent and storm runoff from streets and parking lots. Currently, the preserve staff is working to restore the hydrological processes of the creeks which flow into the prairie. In the past, other sources of water were diverted away from the basin or channeled more directly through it by an extensive system of dikes and canals. Several of these have been eliminated, while others are now used to bring clean water to the prairie, raising water levels and recreating the seasonal flooding that once occurred naturally. The goal of removing several dikes and canals from the prairie is complicated by the existence of privately owned tracts within the basin. Some dikes must be left in place to ensure these areas do not flood when water levels are raised. Efforts to acquire the remainder of the basin must continue if all the restoration goals are to be met. Restoring a natural system also involves reintroducing those animals which were once a vital part of its wildlife community. Early records indicate that small herds of American bison, or buffalo, roamed throughout central Florida until they vanished in the early 1800s. In 1975, 10 bison were brought from Oklahoma and released here so that once again they may be a part of Florida's natural heritage. A herd of scrub cattle also has been established here. They are the descendants of stock brought to Florida by the Spanish in the 1500s. These hardy animals thrived on the native grasses and gave rise to the herds that later ranged throughout frontier Florida. In addition to bison and scrub cattle, a herd of wild Spanish breed horses roams the prairie. Like the scrub cattle, these horses are descendants of stock brought by the Spanish to help them conquer the Americas. Reintroduced to the prairie in 1985, this herd represents the intricate role that Spanish horses have played throughout the history of this prairie. Little is known of the past influence that grazing animals had on Payne's Prairie. Perhaps the greatest value exhibited by the bison, scrub cattle, and Spanish horses is to serve as living links with past centuries. Undertaking the restoration of an area as complex as Payne's Prairie is a task never before attempted by the Florida Park Service. For every action, there is a reaction. Some are predictable and some are not. As restoration efforts continue, information is collected and observations are recorded so that the effects of each action may be evaluated. Whatever is done here in the future, the ultimate objective of every decision will be to restore and preserve this unique piece of natural Florida. Generations yet to come will be able to gaze upon this landscape with the same wonder as that experienced by William Bartram on that spring day in 1774.